Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. The topic for this week is the Russian-Ukrainian war and the possibility of nuclear conflict. This is not something that I'm speculating on. This is what the President of the United States talked about last week at a campaign fundraising event. To bring us into this topic, here are the news headlines from the Washington Post. Biden's scary invocation of nuclear Armageddon. Quote from the article, generally, the right venue to warn that we're facing the biggest threat of Armageddon in 60 years wouldn't seem to be a political fundraiser. But for whatever reason, that's where President Biden on Thursday night decided to offer some of the scariest comments uttered by a U.S. president in decades. Speaking at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee event, Biden said that for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a direct threat of the use of nuclear weapons if, in fact, things continue down the path they are going. Well, let's look at this speech from whitehouse.gov. Biden said, quote, "Let me put it this way. Think about it. We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've got a guy I know fairly well. His name is Vladimir Putin. I spent a fair amount of time with him. He is not joking when he's talking about the potential use of tactical and nuclear weapons, or biological or chemical weapons, because his military is, you might say, significantly underperforming. It's part of Russian doctrine. If the motherland is threatened, they'll use whatever force is needed, including nuclear weapons. I don't think there's any such thing as an ability to easily loose a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon. So there's a lot at stake." Now, earlier in the speech, Biden said, "We have some real difficult decisions to make relative to what's going on in Ukraine, and we're going to continue to support them. But first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a direct threat of the use of nuclear weapon. If, in fact, things continue down the path they've been going, that's a different deal. And we're trying to figure out, what is Putin's off-ramp? Where does he get off? Where does he find a way out? Where does he find himself in a position that he does not only lose face, but loses significant power within Russia?" Unquote, Joe Biden last week. A few news commentators have pointed out that the president shouldn't even be hinting at the prospects of Armageddon. In fact, typical of the world, these people don't understand biblical eschatology. Technically, it's not the prospects of Armageddon, it's the prospects of the apocalypse. The president of France, Macron, said about Biden's comments, "Nuclear war is too delicate a subject to be spoken of carelessly. We must speak with prudence when commenting on such matters. I've always refused to engage in political fiction, especially when speaking of nuclear weapons." However, the left-leaning media that really works as cheerleaders for the Biden administration didn't make much of an issue out of the nuclear comment. But of course, we know if a Republican was in the White House, the media would blow up over such comments. Remember how every foreign policy comment that Trump made, the media for weeks would talk about how the president is going to bring us into nuclear war by his rhetoric. The irony is that Biden, who criticized Trump for the possibility of bringing us into nuclear war, might actually be the one to bring us into nuclear war. I think it was Mark Twain who once said, "There is nothing more base than those who wait until they discover the political party of the man who made the comment before they decide whether the comment was good or evil." But that's where we are today. It's not about truth, it's about power, optics, propaganda. This summer, Victor Davis Hanson, a well-known conservative commentator, did a piece about the increasing talk of nuclear war. This is kind of long, but it gets us into our subject. After writing about nuclear threats in the past and Hollywood movies predicting nuclear war. Hansen writes, every time a non-democratic nation joins the nuclear club, Pakistan in the mid-1980s, North Korea in 2006, the chances of nuclear exchange supposedly increase. But we forget that a number of powerful European and Asian states could easily go nuclear at any time within months. Instead, influential, wealthy nations like Australia, Germany, Japan, South Korea rely on either NATO or the huge nuclear arsenal of the United States to deter their nuclear enemies. If that assurance is ever in doubt, then at any moment they may decide to go nuclear themselves. Nuke talks especially heat up anytime a rogue nation, usually one ostracized by the United Nations, such as Saddam Hussein's Iraq or Gaddafi's regime in Libya or the theocratic Iran, begins enriching uranium. Yet for the most part, as long as the world's three largest nuclear powers, the US, Russia, and China, do not square off in a war or are not sucked into a third-party conflict, the world assumes nukes are out of sight and out of mind, or so we thought until recently. Russian President Vladimir Putin has recently boasted of possibly using nukes against both Ukraine and, more ominously, those NATO countries who aid Kiev. In response, French President Macron reminded Russia that NATO itself has an ample nuclear deterrent. In theory, should NATO and the United States supply Ukraine tanks, artillery, and planes, the fierce Ukrainians could push the entire Russian army entirely out of their country. But would a nuclear Putin allow that? Over the last few weeks, nuclear talks have arisen over a myriad of issues. If the war continues to go badly for Russia, at what point will a seemingly erratic Putin begin to issue nuclear red lines to Ukraine and its allies? Would a crushing defeat push over the edge a nuclear trash-talking Putin, facing the possibility of the end of his regime? Ukraine nuke talks spin off into lots of other places. Nuclear North Korea is resuming its ballistic missile launches to intimidate non-nuclear South Korea and Japan. China is rapidly expanding its nuclear stockpiles and is now talking openly of ending a free Taiwan, warning Taiwan's friends and allies to keep out or else. Iran promises to become nuclear soon. Suddenly, newspapers and blogs seem fixated on hyping the relative stockpiles and megatonnage of various nuclear states as if they were just GDP or energy output data. The world has become nuclear obsessed. Is there a danger in daily normalizing the abnormal and casually thinking the unthinkable? Curbing loose nuclear talk won't calm tensions or guarantee peace, but it wouldn't hurt either, unquote Victor David Hansen. So here's the situation in the Ukraine. Russia is losing to the Ukrainians. Who would have thought? Russia is being driven out of territory recently occupied in Ukraine. Notice Russia wants to create a land bridge between Crimea and Russia. Back in September, Russia conducted a ballot referendum in those occupied regions to see if the people wanted to be part of Russia or Ukraine. This was to give the appearance of democracy and to give Russia some moral authority in taking over those regions. Russia reported that the people voted 90% to be part of Russia. Of course, nobody in the West accepts those results. Russian soldiers were forcing people to vote. Putin had a ceremony at the beginning of October, officially declaring those regions to be part of the Russian Federation. Well, since that referendum and the annexing of those territories, the Ukrainian army has begun to take back those territories. the very territories declared to be officially Russian. So now Russia can claim that their motherland is being invaded. The war in Ukraine is really a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Ukraine would not be winning if the United States wasn't giving them financial aid and advanced military weaponry. U.S. smart missiles and U.S. reconnaissance is slaughtering the Russians. By some estimates, half the troops they have sent in, 90,000, have died in battle. So the Russians are weighing their options. Last week, the Ukrainians blew up the main bridge between Russia and Crimea, the territory that Russia annexed back in 2014. This completely cuts off Crimea from Russia and makes it possible for the Ukrainians to take back Crimea. Putin was rather fond of that bridge because it was just completed in 2018. Now Russia is retaliating with some long-range bombing on Ukrainian cities. Biden and NATO members are now meeting to come up with a response. 2 weeks ago, the Russian gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea, the Nord Stream pipeline 1 and 2 that bring natural gas into Europe, were bombed and cut off, halting much of Russia's revenue from the sale of natural gas. Some commentators claim that Russia blew up its own pipeline, but it's pretty obvious that the Ukrainian army did this, maybe even with U.S. equipment. I mean, in a war, the plan is to destroy your enemy's economy. So now Russia is being backed into a corner, and that's why Biden is speaking about the threat of nuclear conflict. Russia is a proud country, and to avert losing, Russia may resort to nuclear weapons on the battlefield. That's their ace in the hole. So the disadvantage of Russia using nuclear weapons is that the United States and NATO have already stated that they will go in and take out the Russian military in the region using conventional weapons if Putin decides to use nuclear weapons on the battlefield. The U.S. has plenty of cruise missiles, and the U.S. conventional Moab bomb has the blast radius equal to the nuclear bombs dropped in Japan. And if Russia uses nuclear weapons, Russia would go down in history as being a pariah among the nations, breaking all international treaties. And with nuclear weapons, the whole thing could easily escalate. Russia would have to continue to use nuclear weapons to counter NATO's intervention. However, the positive for Russia in using nuclear weapons is that it forces NATO to sit down at the table and agree to some Russian demands. Russia would again be negotiating from the place of power. I mean, sure, the West could destroy Russia, but at what expense to the West? The West would probably much rather give Russia something in exchange for peace. The West really doesn't care much about the Donbass region of Ukraine. They would probably give those territories to Russia in a peace treaty, and Putin can save face in a war that he's losing. As it is, in a conventional war, Russia loses everything. It looks like the only way Russia can turn this war around in their favor is by resorting to nuclear weapons because their conventional forces are defunct. Putin might want to also reestablish the fact that you cannot defeat a nation with nuclear capacity. So despite the apparent disadvantages of using nuclear weapons, there are a few practical reasons why Putin might want to use them in this war. And it's very likely that right now Russia is looking for an excuse to use nuclear weapons because if they ever use them, they will have to have a pretext by which they can blame the West. So this is all very disturbing. But what are the biblical lessons in all this? What is God teaching us in history, his story? Because God is always working to teach us through current events. Are we listening? Well, the first lesson certainly is to be reminded of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. when they, the people of the world, say peace and safety, sudden destruction will come upon them. That text has direct application to the apocalypse, but it's a general principle that's true in every century. Nobody expected World War I or World War II. No one can predict the specific details of the future. Nevertheless, we know that the outcome will be Judgment Day. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11. I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and the battle is not to the warriors. And neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to men of ability, for time and chance overtake them all. Moreover, man does not know his time. Like fish caught in a treacherous net, and birds trapped in a snare, so the sons of men are ensnared at an evil time when it suddenly falls on them. The lesson is that the world is always on a knife's edge. But we don't realize it until certain news items threaten our destruction. I love this quote from C.S. Lewis from his book, The Problem with Pain. He writes, I am progressing along the path of life in my ordinary, contentedly fallen and godless condition, absorbed in a merry meeting with my friends for the morrow, or a bit of work that tickles my vanity today, a holiday or a new book, when suddenly a stab of abdominal pain that threatens a serious disease, or a headline in the newspaper that threatens us all with destruction. It sends the whole pack of cards tumbling down. At first, I'm a bit overwhelmed, and all of my little happiness looks like broken toys. Then slowly and reluctantly, bit by bit, I try to bring myself into the frame of mind that I should be in at all times. I remind myself that all of these toys were never intended to possess my heart, and my true good is in another world, and my only real treasure is Christ. And perhaps by God's grace, I succeed, and for a day or two, become a creature consciously depending upon God and drawing its strength from the right source. But the moment the thread is withdrawn, my whole nature leaps back to the toys. Well, the recent threats of nuclear war may awake us to our precarious existence, but we should have always been aware of that. Some more verses about not knowing the time. Proverbs 27:1. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. Or James chapter 4, verse 13. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you're boasting in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Boasting about what? About what you think the future will be. Also, Luke chapter 12, the rich fool. I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? And also Isaiah 47, verse 10. You felt secure in your wickedness and said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge, they have deluded you. For you have said in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. But evil will come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away. And disaster will fall upon you, for which you cannot atone. And destruction about which you do not know will come upon you suddenly. So these events taking place in the news today remind us that the world is coming to an end. And another lesson we're learning in this Russian-Ukrainian war is the unreliability of the prophets and the pundits. Even before this war began, the foreign policy experts were predicting that Russia would never invade Ukraine. It's just saber-rattling. Logically, Putin has nothing to gain from invading Ukraine. And even after Putin invaded Ukraine, the pundits in the West were all saying that it's only a matter of time before Russia wins. Even Putin himself miscalculated his chances of success. His advisors were wrong. Last week I got into a conversation with a friend of mine in the military, and he pointed out that no one in the West realized the corruption and the dysfunction in the Russian military. The Russian army wasn't being modernized and supported because the money was being siphoned off all the way down the chain of command. But all of the geopolitical experts were claiming that Russia was the number 2 military in the world. Why? Because these pundits never do investigative journalism. They simply rely on what everyone else is saying. These analysts and pundits didn't know what they claimed to know. They don't know or consider all of the factors, and that's true in every age and in every situation. The experts are not omniscient. Psalm 33:10, the Lord nullifies the counsel of nations. He frustrates the plans of the people. Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 26, disaster will come upon disaster, and rumor will be added to rumor, and they will seek a vision from the prophet, but the law will be lost from the priests and the counsel from the elders. Jeremiah 49:7, has good counsel been lost to the prudent? Their wisdom has decayed. Isaiah 19:11, the princes of Zoan are mere fools. The advice of Pharaoh's wisest advisors has become stupid. Job chapter 12, verse 16, with him, God, our strength and sound wisdom. The misled and the misleader belongs to God. He makes counselors walk barefoot and makes fools of judges. And in Job chapter 5, verse 12, that text is quoted by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 19, to teach the truth that the intelligentsia doesn't know what they claim to know. They often get it wrong. Job chapter 5, verse 12, he frustrates the plotting of the shrewd so that their hand cannot attain success. He captures the wise by their own shrewdness, and the advice of the cunning is quickly thwarted. 1 Corinthians 1:19, for it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where's the wise man? Where's the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? In Isaiah chapter 41, the prophet Isaiah rebukes the arrogance of the so-called experts. Isaiah explains that they cannot predict the future even though they claim to know. Isaiah 41:21, let them, the counselors, the prophets, the pundits, bring forth and declare to us what's going to take place. As for the former events, declare what they were, that we may consider them and know their outcome, or announce to us what is coming. In other words, interpret the meaning of past events and tell us what their outcome will be. Verse 23, declare the things that are going to come afterwards, that we may know that you are God's. Indeed, do good or evil, that we may anxiously look about us and fear together. In other words, show us you have the power to change the future for good or evil. Then verse 24, behold, you're of no account, and your work amounts to nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination. And down in verse 28, but when I look, there was no one, and there's no counselor among them, who if I ask, can give an answer. Behold, all of them are false. Their works are worthless. When Germany invaded Czechoslovakia back in 1939, no one predicted that this would be the beginning of World War II. The experts had no idea what events would unfold. There weren't even any religious prophets in the church foretelling the coming of World War II. Everyone at that time thought Hitler would act rationally and logically. It would be insane for him to invade so many countries simultaneously. He should have just been happy with taking over Czechoslovakia. But sin never acts rationally. And this inability to predict the future applies to religious broadcasters. Back in the summer, many religious podcasters were predicting a worldwide famine this fall. It's not happened. But they said this because they heard Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe. And they all repeated each other's talking points. But they didn't know. They didn't have firsthand understanding of how world food markets work. And the Spirit of God was not telling them that there was going to be a famine. How do we know that? Well, there wasn't a famine. They simply assumed that their own thoughts were the Spirit of God. Ezekiel 13, they were speaking from their own inspiration and following their own spirit. Just like so many prophetic pundits predicted that Donald Trump would get the next 4 years in the White House. And they all claimed Amos chapter 3, verse 7. Surely the Lord does nothing unless he reveals his secret counsel to his servants, the prophets. Well, that's not referring to God revealing every single event to come in history, but the significant events in God's redemption plan. Even the Old Testament prophets didn't foretell the names of the subsequent kings of Israel or the outcome of each battle. I stopped predicting elections years ago because I'm not a prophet in the Old Testament sense, and there are too many variables that cannot be measured. There's all of this talk about a Republican wave in the November election, but we don't know. Things could happen between now and election day that change the whole mood of the country. So instead, my comfort and advice to the church is that we don't have a need to know. Give up, surrender your need to know. Instead, we need to be doing what we ought to do regardless of the future. And there's no compelling spiritual reason we need to know certain world events or who will be the next leader. The general knowledge of the apocalypse described in the book of the Revelation and the general knowledge of what you sow, you reap is sufficient for us. Remember the words of Jesus, which stand in stark contrast with this desire for prophetic insight. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. But sadly, many Christian people will flock to the channels that provide the latest predictions. But you, my brethren, don't be fooled by these false prophets. These prognosticators really don't know. Always remember that lesson in Isaiah 41. Now, having said all this, that doesn't mean that the world is safe or secure. The Ukrainian-Russian war is reminding us that the world is always standing on the edge of a precipice. People have been assuming that the world has grown in sophistication, that we're past the Cold War threat of an all-out nuclear war, but not so. The world is still on a hairpin trigger. The experts thought World War I would end all wars. I mean, with the modern weapons and the carnage in World War I, they thought Europeans would no longer engage in such warfare, but then came World War II. Given the sinful nature of man, the fact that the world has not used nuclear weapons in battle for the last 77 years has been a miracle, the restraining hand of God. But it's inevitable. They'll be used someday, most likely in the apocalypse. There are a number of factors in the present situation that look bad, that foreshadow nuclear conflict. I mean, nobody knows for sure, but these are the kind of setups that often end up in major conflicts. First, the political left used to be peaceniks. But for some strange reason, the left has become very hawkish. It almost seems as if some of the radical leaders on the left want there to be a major war, a crisis that can give them power, like the COVID crisis or the global warming crisis. Here's an article by a pundit, Martin Armstrong. entitled "The West Needs World War III." Why? The New World Order, so-called Great Reset plan for humanity, now needs war to try and make it work. They're increasing the pressure on just about everything under the sun. The West needs World War III. They just need it. And then he goes on to explain how the West's deficit spending has gotten out of control and the only way out of the crisis is a war. Well, this is the new mindset of the radical left. They want to destroy the current system because they've been taught to hate what it is. They want to bring in a globalistic, socialistic, borderless utopia. God may give them what they want. Another bad sign is that our current president, Joe Biden, has a reputation for talking tough and pushing his weight around, and he has a reputation for failure. Remember President Obama's comments before the election? Don't underestimate Joe Biden's ability to mess things up. Of course, Obama used a different word. In an interview with Jake Tapper this week, Biden walked back his nuclear comments by saying he doesn't think Putin will use nuclear weapons. Well, that's not much of an assurance. Remember, before the election, the former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, in his memoirs, wrote, Biden has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. Why is that? Well, because Biden has a wrong, secular, biblically uninformed worldview. Then we must factor into the future prospects of the Biden administration the curse upon those leaders who forsake the law of God. This current administration is pushing abortion, transgenderism, LGBTQ issues, and there's a curse on such nations and leaders, Deuteronomy chapter 28, but it will come about if you will not obey the Lord your God. Cursed shall you be when you come in, cursed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will send upon you curses, confusions, and rebuke in all that you undertake to do until you're destroyed and until you perish quickly. But you say, wait a minute, that was Old Testament. That only applies to Israel. Well, are you sure of that? Are you willing to take that gamble? We ought to always have a healthy fear of the Lord. Just like God did to ancient Israel, God could make sure everything this administration touches turns into a disaster. The very thing the left claims that conservatives would bring upon the country, they might bring upon the country. This week, Tulsi Gabbard, the Democrat candidate for president back in 2020, recently came out with a video explaining why she's leaving the Democrat Party. Back in 2020, she was the most conservative Democrat candidate, so it's no surprise that she's fed up with the direction of her party. So let's listen to her analysis of the party. It's only a minute.
I can no longer remain in today's Democratic Party that's under the complete control of an elitist cabal of warmongers who are driven by cowardly wokeness, who divide us by racializing every issue and stoking anti-white racism, who actively work to undermine our God-given freedoms that are enshrined in our Constitution, who are hostile to people of faith and spirituality, who demonize the police but protect criminals at the expense of law-abiding Americans, who believe in open borders, who weaponize the national security state to go after their political opponents, and above all, who are dragging us ever closer to nuclear war. Now, I believe in a government that's of the people, by the people, and for the people. Unfortunately, today's Democratic Party does not. Instead, it stands for a government that is of, by, and for the powerful elite. Now, I'm calling on my fellow common sense, independent-minded Democrats to join me in leaving the Democratic Party. If you can no longer stomach the direction that the so-called woke Democratic Party ideologues are taking our country, then I invite you to join me.
So Gabbard says that the Democrat Party is under the control of an elitist cabal of warmongers who are driven by cowardly wokeness. What's she talking about? Well, domestically, the Democrat Party is warring against many traditional Western values and institutions. But also in foreign policy, the Democrat Party is stepping into this war against Russia. And as Gabbard points out, there's a connection between the left's woke ideology and the current hawkish position of the Democrat Party. Maybe it has something to do with the judgmentalism, the moral superiority, the cockiness of wokeness. But whatever, notice that Tulsi Gabbard sees a connection between the path the Democrats are taking and their ideology. And she's right. We act according to our beliefs, according to our worldview. Then Tulsi Gabbard goes on to list the immoral ideology of the Democrat Party, the lawlessness. Then she says, above all, the party is dragging us ever closer to nuclear war. Is she a prophetess? No. She simply sees the current policies of the party as poking the bear. And it will not end well. So also, in the providence of God, Putin is an ideologue who will sacrifice his people to ensure a victory and a Russian legacy. The former Prime Minister of Sweden tweeted out, in a meeting with Duma members yesterday, Putin said his war against Ukraine is, quote, only the beginning of a radical breakdown of the U.S.-style world order, and, quote, transition from the liberal globalist American egocentrism. For Putin, it's nothing less than a war for the world. Putin wants to change history, to take down American dominance, and China, North Korea, Iran, and the entire Middle East have the same goal. Furthermore, in the providence of God, there are currently no world leaders working to sit down at the table with Russia and work out a peace agreement. Elon Musk, a classic liberal, gave some foreign policy advice last week. Have the UN redo the elections in the Donbass. And if the people want to be Russian, give the land to Russia. But even the left criticized that proposal because they want Russia completely defeated and removed. So maybe the Russian-Ukrainian war is the perfect storm. A confluence of events that will bring about a major worldwide conflict. But even if we, can't foretell the outcomes, we should at least be aware of the dangers. We're still to use these events to remind the unsaved that the world in which they have put their hopes will pass away with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed with an intense heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. That's 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. And Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 13. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that the people toil for fire, and the nations grow weary for nothing? 1 John 2:17, the world is passing away. And I'm always reminded of this text. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 29. Paul writes, but this I say, brethren, the time has been shortened. And those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it, for the form of this world is passing away. All these signs we see of coming disaster, even in our own personal lives, are meant to turn us back to God. As C.S. Lewis wrote, pain is God's megaphone. And please don't imagine, like so many people do today, that you will be able to escape the judgment because you have built a safe house or because you have stockpiled provisions. The Bible has a lot to say about what happens to people who think they can outsmart the judgment. Again, Isaiah 47:11, but evil will come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away. And disaster will fall upon you, for which you cannot atone, and destruction about which you do not know will come upon you suddenly. When judgment was coming upon ancient Israel, the prophet Amos explained to the people that all of their plans for safety will fail. In fact, God will make sure that those who try to escape will meet their judgment. Amos chapter 5, verse 19, you will escape a lion, and then you're going to meet a bear. Or you'll finally get to your home, to your safe house, and you're going to lean on the wall and be bitten by a poisonous snake. Or Jeremiah chapter 48, verse 44, the one who flees from the terror will fall into the pit, and the one who climbs out of the pit will be caught in a snare. And again, notice that last phrase in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3, and they will not escape. The only safety is Christ. The only escape is coming to Christ for salvation, being one of his people, because his people will be rescued. Daniel chapter 12, everyone found in God's book will be rescued. Or Luke 21:18, Jesus said, not a hair on our head will perish. So in Christ, we're indestructible. We're untouchable in this world until God calls us home. The world is passing away, but the one who does the will of God lives forever. I hope that's an encouragement. Thank you for listening. Subscribe, like, share, leave a comment below. And may Jesus Christ reign.